Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Flesch. I'm the director of the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museums, and welcome to the 2021 Winter Lyceum. Today is the 7th day of February, 2021, during a polar vortex here in southwestern Wisconsin. I'd like to thank all of you who have registered to participate live today, as well as those who may be watching a recording of this event from our library of virtual programs. I extend a warm welcome to current friends of the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museums, members and donors. And I'd like to thank the sponsors whose financial support has made this program possible. Taco John's, H&R Block, A&W Restaurant of Platteville, and Inspiring Community. So before I introduce today's speaker, Patrick Daniels, I'd just like to make a few announcements. Every year is special at the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museums, but this year marks 3 major milestone anniversaries, and I'd love to invite you to help us celebrate. 2021 marks the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Mining Museum in the Rock School building in 1971. It's also the 45th anniversary of the opening of the Bevins lead mine in the museum's backyard. That was back in 1976 for the American Bicentennial. And it also marks the 40th anniversary of the opening of the Rollo Jamison Museum in the Brick Hanmer Robbins School building. That was back in 1981. It was 56 years ago when the Common Council adopted the ordinance establishing the Platteville Museum Board. That was 1965. And since then, the museums remain Platteville's leading tourist attraction. And we've welcomed hundreds of thousands of visitors, about a third school children, to discover the science, industry, and the cultural heritage of our unique mineral region. Our museums and the world's largest M above us on Platte Mound commemorate the unique physical geography of the Upper Mississippi Valley Lead Zinc District, as well as a way of life upon the land that led to the birth of Wisconsin as the Badger State. Our museums were formed in stages. Its parts were separated in physicality as well as in interpretation. 5 years ago, the museum board rebranded as the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museums after completing a museum assessment program, organizational assessment, in order to better unite the educational narratives of the museum campus. Last summer, our museums began the process of interpretive planning. The primary takeaway of that kickoff session was that the expression of human ingenuity, inquiry, enterprise, and development, what might be called the pioneering spirit in the context of our region over a long timeline, is a theme that can inspire optimism in our community and connect Platteville's past to its bright future. The mission of the museums remains to continue in the pursuit of excellence in the areas of regional and mining history. To achieve that purpose, the museums are commissioned to be custodians of the past, to interpret the rich lead and zinc mining heritage of our region, as well as to preserve, interpret, and to display the artifacts that define all of southwestern Wisconsin. Our vision is to be the premier mining and regional history museum in the upper Midwest, and to instill appreciation of the past and a sense of place for the future. This year, I'd like to invite all of you to help us celebrate our 50th, 45th, and 40th anniversaries as the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museums kick off this celebratory year with some special events and programs. These include 2 special presentations that bookend the Winter Lyceum lecture series, the first of which is tonight's presentation focusing on Rollo Jamison and his collection, and the second of which will be the last presentation in the Winter Lyceum on March 28th that will focus on the Mining Museum's Bevins Mine adventure 45 years later. The anniversary celebrations will also include Community Free Day, which will take place on May 1st and October 31st. Those are our tour season's first day, opening day, and the closing days. And Community Free Day will allow Platteville residents to visit the museums free of charge. We also invite you to the Miners Ball on September 17th. We invite you to check out a new anniversary exhibition on the regional pioneering spirit that connects our regional history to concepts of STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. The title of this exhibit is based on a quotation by Rollo Jamison himself. "There's nothing new under the sun. Our grandparents don't get credit for the work they done." So stay up to date on these and many more programs and initiatives in store for this anniversary year. Plus, make your reservations, your donations, become a member online at www.mining.jamison.museum. And now, before we begin our program, I'd like to invite you to participate in a question and answer session at the end of this evening's Lyceum presentation. Because we're a group of well over 100 today, and because we're doing this via Zoom, in the interest of time, I'd like to invite you to type out your questions as they come to mind and to submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So I invite you to take a moment to look for that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, which is different than the chat function. So again, at the end of the presentation, our speaker will answer the questions in the order in which they are received. So without further ado, I am now pleased to introduce tonight's special guest speaker. Patrick Daniels grew up in Platteville and has been a volunteer with the Rollo Jamison Museum since it was located in Beetown. His primary focus has been on the mechanical music part of the collection. He's been demonstrating phonographs, music boxes, and organettes on Heritage Days annually since 1981, initially under the watchful eye of his father, Jerry Daniels, who was the first president of the organization known as the Jamison Museum Association, now known as the Friends of the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museums, and was instrumental in moving the collection from Beetown to Platteville. In tonight's talk, titled Rollo Jamison, 40 Years in Platteville, Mr. Patrick Daniels will outline Rollo's life and his desire to create a museum in Beetown and moving his collection from Platteville to Beetown. Mr. Daniels first operated a 78 RPM phonograph when he was in kindergarten, listening to tap dance lesson records. He was amazed by an Edison Amberola 50. That's his great grandfather's, and he still has. He also has a collection of shellac records, as well as cylinder recordings. And in addition to yearly maintenance of the Rollo Jamison Museum's phonograph and music box collection, he's helped with the maintenance and care of phonographs and organettes in private collections. Most recently, he's also assisted in the restoration of a roller organ for the Greene County Historical Society. It's my great honor to welcome Patrick Daniels.
Thank you for that introduction. I'll get my screen sharing going here, so hopefully everybody can see that, and just want to make sure that that Q&A session is able to be utilized for this too. So if you have any questions, just type it in, and we'll answer it at the end. And I guess with that introduction, I think that touches a little bit on Rollo's life and that entrepreneurial spirit of the pioneering spirit as well. And so what I'm going to touch on today is a little bit of history of Beetown and life of Rollo, and moving the museum, and just touching on the Heritage Days as well. And many of the pictures included are at the Southwest Wisconsin room at University of Wisconsin Platteville, which is one of the places that my dad worked at the Cameron Library at the time. And just thanks to James Hibbard for working with me on getting that information in a digital format to share with you all. Also, some of the pictures came from the museum archives, as well as from Corey Kopp and my mom, and Grant County Historical Society, and a new friend, Nancy Moore. My involvement with the Rollo Jamison Museum really started over 40 years ago with my parents, Nancy and Jerry Daniels. And this is a picture, rather scholarly picture of our family from 1980. And my dad was the first JMA president, and my mom was the publicity chair. And I'm on the right side with a little bit less facial hair. And before we get into our involvement with the museum, let's just start with where the museum came from, and to do that, we have to look a little bit at the history of the Southwest Wisconsin and Rollo's life. And in 1827, Beetown was initially established in the lead mining region as a mine called B Lead. Because some prospectors camped near a tree that had toppled in a storm, exposed a ingot of lead. It was like 425 pounds. So it was a huge lead ingot. And the tree also had bees in it. So it was the bee tree with bee lead in it. And by 1845, Beetown was one of the largest communities in Grant County, just behind Potosi and Platteville. And in fact, Rollo used to point out at one point, Beetown was larger than Chicago, as this 1830 Chicago picture showed that it only had 100 people in it. And there are other Lyceum talks that'll go into more detail about some of the history of the area, but now let's just concentrate on the Jamisons. And Rollo's great-grandparents moved here from Missouri, much like many people did, sometime between the 1860s, or sometime in there, after migrating from New Jersey and Pennsylvania areas. And pictured here is Adam Jamison on the left and his son James on the right, and that's Rollo's grandfather. And this was basically right after the heyday of Beetown, which was went from a population of 2,200 in 1848 to less than 1,000 by 1850. And that's partly due to the California gold rush, but also depleting, the surface lead mining activities that were available. And so fast forward to 1898, when George and Stella Jamison, George is James's son. They got married. George and Stella did, and Rollo was born on their family farm in Beetown in Grant County on July 15th of 1899. And this is Rollo and baby Stella, his younger sister, with old pal in 1904. And the expression "off your rocker" comes to mind here because you can see Rollo is on a rocking chair with only one rocker. So it really makes you wonder, why the rocker is missing from the chair, but actually the expression "off your rocker" might also originally refer to part of a rail car, if it becomes detached and you might, that might take you off the rails. So shown here is the whole family, George and Ray and Rollo in the back, and he's the oldest of the four siblings, and then Leroy and Stella, and Stella the daughter, and then also Stella the mother. And this was taken basically right before George left for Vancouver, British Columbia. And George went there with his brother and his brother's family to find gainful employment. And later, another brother would also migrate to Canada, where they were all successful in employment. But Stella never went to Canada. And so here's the Jamison house, obviously taken, well, not obviously, but pretty obviously taken on the same day. And Rollo said that after his father left, they were very poor and they only had Caro syrup and crackers to eat for a week. And when his uncle, who ran the Beetown store, John, not the John that ran it for most people knew him around Beetown. He passed away in September, but John Jamison was the grandfather of John Jamison. But when his John Jamison, the grandfather, found out that they were basically starving, he told Stella that he wouldn't let family do that, and so extended a shop credit or a tab for her. And Rollo was determined that he was going to pay it off, so he started working at a nearby farm to pay off the family debt. And he said they had accumulated about $135 in store charges, and he was earning about 25 cents a day back then. So you can see how that might take a while to pay off. And this is a shot of the family farm buildings, probably taken in sometime in the 1930s after the Jamisons had moved to town. And due to their poor circumstances, they had to move around a lot, but always staying around Beetown. So backing up chronologically a little bit, and kind of the picture is a little bit forward, but representing some of the stuff. Rollo said that he started collecting by following his father's plow and picking up arrowheads in 1905. And even at that young age, he wondered, who made them and how they came to be in his father's field. And in the chronologically fast forwarding, this is a picture shows Rollo and a helper plowing the field as a demonstration project for Beetown school kids and 4-H students in the 50s and 60s, which he did like fairly frequently. And here is a picture on the left of Rollo when he was about 18 or 20, which corresponds when he was working on the road crew in Iowa near Dyersville, where he picked up a Peter Pan gramophone. And before he left for the job, his mother told him, "You daren't spring anything, any home. You daren't spring any junk home." But when he showed her the music box, she thought that it could stay. And Rollo said that being poor, he wasn't invited to any parties, but then he got his phonograph and he was always invited to the parties with the caveat, being sure and bring your music box. So here's a colorized photo of Rollo and Goldie Main, and they went out for about 4 years and got engaged. But when Goldie said, "You have to choose, it's either you're collecting or me," you know how that turned out. I think there's still some relatives, Main relatives around Beetown yet today too. So. And here's a picture of Rollo's repair shop that he built from rough cut lumber that he got from a farmer who owed him about $150 for work that Rollo did that he never paid for. So Rollo opened the auto mechanic shop, repair shop in 1921. So you can see that already he's kind of taken on some of the new technology that's around. I mean, there weren't that many opportunities for understanding how to learn auto mechanic, but he got some magazines from the local store and read them, and he thought he could do a good job at it. But he repaired all sorts of things at his repair shop. And you might notice the gentleman here carrying jugs, which may or may not contain moonshine. During Prohibition, there were many country stills around southwest Wisconsin, and at least one of which Rollo helped with because they knew he wouldn't snitch on him. And Rollo also said that the Grant County Sheriff knew what was going on, but as long as it didn't get out of control, he wasn't going to do anything about it. And then 1941, Rollo decided that he had had enough of the auto mechanic business, fixing stuff people needed only for them not to pay him. And so he opened a tavern and called Spring Valley Tavern. And he figured nobody needed to drink. So if they wanted to drink, they'd have to pay for it. However, I think that Rollo's viewed it more as a kind of a social gathering place and a place to gather and socialize and talk history than a business to make money. Notice there's nobody behind the bar. and that's probably because Rollo was talking with somebody about history and taking the photographs. Um, and and as you can see in this picture, Rollo had amassed an already sizable collection. And some people say that the Spring Valley Tavern was really more of a museum than a tavern. And actually, my mom pointed out that picture could represent 5 generations of people in the picture, with the little baby and mom and dad and grandpa and great grandpa maybe. But I'd be interested to hear some of the people that live in Beetown that might have a recollection of who that is, who those are. In 1942, Rollo was drafted into the U.S. Army, where he served at Camp Rucker in Alabama as a military police, and he was honorably discharged on July 15 of 1943 when he aged out of active service. And while in the service, he was impressed at how some of the servicemen didn't get any correspondence during mail call. And when he came back, he organized a letter writing campaign called the Hometown Club, which met every Wednesday at the Spring Valley Tavern, and wrote letters about what was going on in Beetown, specifically to those the servicemen that are listed. And these letters were sent to the boys in service all over the world. And over the course of the letter writing campaign through the Korean War, the Hometown Club sent an estimated 15,000 letters. And also in that picture, you can also see the lithic artifacts on the wall too. So, that collection was really developing, even further than some of the other stuff. And then in 1947, he bought a wire recorder by saving money from stopping smoking and drinking, so he could record oral history, because he only had a 4th grade education and couldn't read and write so well. And over the years, he recorded over 300 interviews and is known as a pioneer in recorded oral history. I know that my dad was trying to determine whether or not he actually did the first systematic oral history recording in Wisconsin. And there is, but it kind of lends to that he was one of the first ones in Wisconsin, at least, to do some of that systematic oral history. In 1951, after constructing the main Quonset hut of 30 by 60 foot building, he got out of the tavern business and fulfilling a lifelong dream to open a museum to save history. And you can see here one of the school groups of children that would visit his museum. And Rollo was a janitor at the Beetown school and had many activities with his school children, from mine excursions and planting and harvesting in the old-fashioned manner, and Christmas tree outings, all through the lens of history. And he not only had the Quonset hut, but he also had other buildings which he moved to the museum land. And this is a picture showing the hotel building being moved past the Spring Valley Tavern. And here's a picture of the log cabin that would be close to 200 years old if it had survived. And Alvin Bontrager, who bought the Beetown place, said that the roof leaked and the outer parts of the wood had powder post beetle damage, and so it had to be torn down. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves on some of that issues, but so let's get back inside. Inside each of the buildings were artifacts packed tight, and and this picture is probably from the late 50s, early 60s, and it looks like it's full, but it's nowhere near as full it was when in the 70s, when Rollo really had it filled up with saved bits of history. And Rollo was always bringing something home, and neighbors would always make an effort to stop by to see what interesting piece of history Rollo had dragged home. One thing Rollo liked to do was also point out some of the modern improvements are really just modifications of previous inventions. As Eric pointed out, there's one of his quotes that he liked to quote fairly often was "There's nothing new under the sun." Is kind of one of his mottos, I guess, and obviously that has historical significance too. But here he's showing the similarities between Regina music box tune sheet holes and an IBM punch card. And remember, this is in the 60s or in 60s and 80s in that time frame. And the tune sheet music box dates from 1880s or 1885 or so, and the IBM punch card was invented in 1928, but is really seen as a staple, kind of a new technology in the 50s and 60s. And here's a picture of the museum campus from the late 70s, maybe might be 1980 actually. And you can't see all the buildings from the picture, but starting from the left is the blacksmith shop with an attached carriage lean-to. And then the hotel complex isn't visible behind the willow tree, but you can just see the top of the log cabin, then the Quonset hut. And on the other side of the Quonset hut was a church, a harness shop, and a one-room school. And nestled next to the Quonset hut, you can see Rollo's mobile home. And when people ask him why he didn't sell some of the stuff and get a better place to live, he'd always just kind of smile and just say, to save as much history as he could. So he's more into saving history and the artifacts than with his own personal comfort. And I don't have a good winter photo of the museum, but if you can imagine, this is all covered in snow, a lot of snow, and in the 70s, there's a couple really good snowstorms, and by this time, Ricky Olhoven had become a friend of Rollo's, and they were concerned about the snow load on the roofs. So Rick and a buddy of his came over to help shovel the snow off the roofs, and his buddy actually fell through a roof right on a square grand piano, which had powder post beetle damage, so much that the legs just disintegrated in a cloud of dust, and actually probably helped break the guy's fall too. But that was kind of the state of the collection when that it was basically just rotting away, and Rollo couldn't really take care of it because he had health issues by that time. And Rick is pictured left in his high school yearbook picture. Said to Rollo, "We just got to find a new home for the museum. Otherwise, it's just gonna." It's just going to get sold off, or it's not going to survive. And a lot of people tried to find a home for the museum, and eventually Cindy Moore, pictured on the right, and Bob Kanuzik and Mike Esch brought it to the Platteville school board, and in 1979, the school board opened a new elementary school named after Neil Wilkins, and he's in the picture on the far right in the back row. And he unexpectedly passed away on October 26th of 1979, and he was one of the school board members, and he was a big proponent of getting the new school built, and because Hannah Robbins wasn't safe for students to be having school in there all the time, and so that's why they named the new building after Neil Wilkins. And also in this picture is Don Reinecke, who's the superintendent, at the time and played a large role in getting the collection to Platteville. And you can see him in the back row on the left. And then also in the center in the white jacket is Merlin Gerke, who is also played a big role in this. And one of the first things that Don did was organize community meetings, and the result of that was a formation of the Jamison Museum Association. And Eric also pointed out that just a few years ago, they renamed it to the Friends of the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museum. Um, and pictured here are the original officers, Merlin Gerke, he's the vice president, and Doc Harrell was the treasurer, and Gail Kopp was the secretary, and Jerry Daniels was the president. And the picture on the lower right shows me in the lower right handing out agendas for the first meeting with my sister Diana and Betty Burgett. And a shout out to the Platteville Shakespeare Festival, as shown on my shirt. And we were involved with that too. And the JMA would go on to have a wide variety of members with many different backgrounds, and farmers and school staff and university staff and city people and chamber of commerce people, basically, from all works of life, and it was like really kind of interesting to see how all of these different people came together for a common cause. And I wish I could name them all, but you could have biographies on each one of them, and it would take too long for the presentation anyway. So bringing the museum to Platteville was not without controversy, and there's still people who think the museum should have stayed in Beetown, and others thought that the city Platteville shouldn't pay for the museum. And the Beetown, they just didn't have the money. I mean, they're a small municipality, or small township, and they just didn't have the money to support a museum that size. And and still it was like also dwindling population too. And then so the city of Platteville, we had some people that were in pretty good support of it. Merle Strauss was the city manager, and he actually received a petition, after the city had, basically accepted it, saying that the petition didn't want to have any city funds associated with the new museum, because we need to do city things. So Merle could have just accepted the petition, and then the museum wouldn't have gone through at all. But he thought it was good to put it before the people. And so he got it on, it was kind of a rush job, but he got it on a ballot. And in order to get it on the ballot, he had to draft the referendum to be compliant with whatever laws. And so the wording of it was like basically messed up. So a no vote meant that you wanted to provide funding for the museum, and so that was in support of the museum. And a yes vote was saying that you didn't want to have any funds going to the museum, and so then that would have killed it. And so that was a wording issue, and trying to overcome that. It was a very short time between knowing about the referendum wording and the election day. So my mom, who was Nancy Daniels, and who was a publicity chair, kind of had her work cut out for her with her press releases and yard signs and lining up radio interviews and editorials. And there's a whole organization of how to get this thing out and known about how people should vote. And just before the elections was Dairy Days, And the Jamison Museum Association kind of pulled out all the stops and had 7 entries into the parade, including this wagon, which is the pink wagon, as by the owners are in Lancaster by the last name of Pink. And you can see I'm in the yellow shirt in there. And notice the sign hanging off the back of it is a sign that says "Vote No." And Rollo Jamison was also the parade marshal for the parade. And here you can see him passing uh, um, Roundtree Hall. And a lot of buggies were actually pulled by horses, like this top buggy with Keely Kopp in an 1890s dress. And this is the top buggy that is on display in the East Display Room at the museum right now. And same with the Surrey with the fringe on top being pulled by horses. But some were on trailers for this, partly due to the frailty of them, but is also had a lot to do with the horses. You can only find so many people that are willing to hook a horse up to existing wagons and pull them. And some of these are pretty old and frail too. So and having horses that may not be familiar with pulling something like that could be a problem too. But here's Rollo with the medicine wagon and the mail wagons after the parade. But the publicity paid off, and here are a few of the articles about the vote. 70% of the votes were cast in favor of the museum staying, and so it was basically a resounding success. And with the referendum out of the way, the logistics of it, we're trying to move this enormous collection. I mean, there's estimates of 100,000 artifacts in there, and so how do you move the contents of 7 buildings worth of artifacts and collection history? And a lot of people helped with that first move and inventorying things before they got moved. And then there's actually several different committees that were associated with it. There was an acquisition committee, and there was a moving committee, and there's also building committee, and because there was a lot of construction that needed also to happen in Hannah Robbins to get it acceptable to house the collection. But getting the stuff moved from Beetown was under the direction of Merlin Gerke, who rounded up people, and friends and neighbors who he was able to get them to use their use of the cattle trailers and trucks to haul stuff off, and from Beetown to Platteville in an orderly fashion, and making sure that nothing was damaged in transit. And making sure that it all ended up in the appropriate locations and stuff. And just in if you're ever around cattle trailers, you know how much it even takes to clean one of those out. And basically, they had to be at least somewhat clean to put all these artifacts in. So this was a pretty massive undertaking that took several months to really do. And then it was all bringing it over to Hannah Robbins, and there's an estimate of over 8,000 miles were traveled by the volunteers between Beetown and Platteville. I didn't actually look up what the distance is, but it's not anywhere near 8,000 miles. But they traveled that distance, bringing the different items over from Beetown. And almost all of it was brought over by the end of December in 1980. And here's a scan of the Platteville Journal 1980 end of the year special edition or review. And the photo on the right is with my dad, Jerry Daniels, and Miles Genthy, taken in the Southwest Wisconsin room, and when it was in the Carmen Library, talking about some of the significance of the wire recordings there, and then on the left is a picture from the parade. Basically, saying that the Jamison Museum collection is the top story of 1980 for Platteville. So then Rollo moved to Platteville after the collection was pretty much moved, getting an apartment in Jenner Towers, and Suzanne Buchert kind of felt bad for him. She was a museum employee at the time, thinking that he'd be so lonely and not knowing anybody. And so she took him to breakfast at the Owl Cafe one morning, thinking that she'd introduce him around, but as soon as he entered, everybody knew him and greeted him, just started talking about old times, and everybody already knew Rollo, much to Susan's surprise. I think that kind of just shows, how, Rollo was just like a friend, immediately friend with everybody that he met. And while the museum was getting set up, there was also a fundraiser and awareness being brought up, such as the fundraiser at the Hoist House. And that it was still going strong. This publicity around it was still growing strong in anticipation of opening the museum with a whopping 2 display rooms, which is vastly different than the complex at Beetown. And we were trying to represent it, but trying to make sure that it was done in a way that could represent that museum quality experience. And shown here is Rollo with Tud Bowden, leader of the Wundos, who has performed at many Heritage Days, and Frank and Link Byrne, also owners of the Hoist House at the time. And that was I really appreciate some of the things that Tud's done for the museum over the years too. And on this weekend, on the weekend of June 12th through the 14th of 1981, the grand opening celebration, which received national coverage, was held, culminating with a dedication of the museum. And in the picture on the left, taken by Wes Kopp, on the left side is Cindy Moore, and then Doc Harrell and Rollo and Bev Johansson, the city council president, and Merle Strauss, the city manager, and Ivers Kalnins, Rollo's attorney. Behind my dad, Jerry Daniels at the microphone, and Gail Kopp and Merlin Gerke, and Richard Ernie, who's the director of the Wisconsin State Historical Society, who came down for this dedication of the museum. And you can see me in the left picture, or on the right picture in the left window, in the green shirt. And I was helping unfurl the 38 star flag that was part of Rollo's collection, and residents of Beetown will be familiar with that. I know that he flew it at the Beetown Centennial Parade as well. But I had one job for that dedication, and that was to keep Rollo in his wheelchair and push him around as much as I could. And you can see all these pictures. Rollo's not in any of in a wheelchair at all. It was just such a special day to him, and the dedication, was attended by Rollo, but at the time he was actually in a VA hospital, and Cindy Moore, and you can see her in the orange yellow shirt in the picture on the left, being ready, poised to help Rollo, remembers calling up the hospital and begging them to release Rollo, because it was such an important day for Rollo. And my dad and sister drove up to Madison to take him out for the day. And you know, and I'm supposed to keep him in the wheelchair, and he was just so excited about the whole day, and it was just so proud of it. And and this was in June, and then by the end of August, he had passed away. But knowing that his collection was in good hands in Platteville. And you can also see Rollo and Ivers Kalnin's in the suit, and Don Reinecke with his back to the camera. And in the picture on the right is Alvin Bontrager, who bought Rollo's Beetown place and still lives there. There's a lot of friends and family, or lots of friends at that dedication as well. And there's a lot of activities going on that weekend. A Platteville Community Theater play and opening of the Roundtree Gallery. That was the first time that was unveiled, and wagon rides and city band performances and fun runs and demonstrations and tours, and these celebrations are still carried out on Heritage Day each year. And I hope we can continue this tradition for many years to come. And one way to ensure these happen is by making sure the museum is adequately funded. In the recent years, that funding source from the city funds, which is so crucial, has come under fire again, and they've had to have some pretty significant cuts from city funding. But basically everybody has the opportunity to help by going on to websites, or the Jamison's a website, and joining as a friend, or just clicking on the donate button. And I just going back to the original content, when Eric approached me to talk about doing this talk, I was a little hesitant, as I was only a kid when it happened, and it kind of led me to talk to a lot of amazing people who were actually there and got their perspective on it. And I interviewed almost 30 people for this endeavor, and it was really neat hearing how many people were so affected and touched by Rollo and his collection. And I'd just like to a shout out to everybody here for helping out with this presentation. So yeah, let's open it up for questions.
That was wonderful, Patrick. Thank you very much. I'd just like to also mention that besides all of the oral history work that you did in preparation for this talk, some of those photographs are wonderful, and many haven't seen them for a long time, if ever, because you went and were doing firsthand scanning of photographs at the Southwest Wisconsin Archives. So,
yeah, that was actually pretty fun. I remember seeing some of these pictures when I was a kid, but obviously, they're definitely historical artifacts, and my dad was very, whenever we were at the around anything, he's like, all right, now remember, don't touch anything. So it was kind of interesting to see some of these pictures that I'd seen many years ago.
Patrick, a few people have already begun typing in some questions into the Q&A, and others, if you haven't already entered in your questions into the Q&A, this is a great time to start doing that. So we can go ahead and start going through them one by one. Sarah Lomas Flesh asks, Rollo is such an interesting and unique name. Is there any information on its derivation or family significance?
Yeah, I'm not really sure of this family significance. I have heard of Rollo's before, but yeah, it is a little bit of a unique name, but I don't think it's so much out of the time frame that it was in. So I think that his name is kind of fitting, and that he was a unique kind of an individual too. So, but I haven't researched that.
Well, it's maybe you can help fill in a gap or two. When you just Google it, you see Rollo as a boy's name of German or Estonian origin, meaning wolf, or it could be kind of a pet form of Roland, Rudolph, and Ralph. But on the other hand, another view, Patrick, that I saw is that it could be a Norse name, named for a particular Viking who was the first ruler of Normandy. But do you happen to know anything about his family ancestry, where they may have come from?
Yeah, I should have looked at that more, and I do know that I don't know that there's I didn't remember what their background was, but I do know that from the early 1800s, the 1805 is kind of as far back as I went. Basically, all of them were in the United States already. So they've been in the United States at some degree for a fairly significant period. But that Germanic English German background is pretty prevalent in some of the history stuff that he was talking about. So I would assume that's kind of his heritage.
Dave Ralph has a question for you, Patrick. Did Lancaster want the Jamison Museum for its community?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one. Rollo in 1966, the Lancaster School District decided to close the Beetown School, and so that is one of the things that he didn't think that Lancaster really should have the collection because they were not good to Beetown itself. But they were still talking with, what Lancaster would, uh, could do with that, but it wasn't. Definitely, if Lancaster wanted the Jamison Museum, they would have had to bend over backwards to get it because of the basically the hard feelings that Rollo, and he was a janitor at the school there, and but he's retirement age at that time anyway, but he thought it was bad that the Lancaster school decided to bus all the kids from Beetown up to Lancaster instead of having them, taught locally.
Okay, Cindy Bush says that her grandparents, Henry and Iva Myers, lived in Beetown from 1937 to 1947. They had the Myers grocery store there and were good friends of Rollo. Her mom went to school in Beetown and has interesting stories of her life there. She remembers going to Rollo's museum growing up with her grandparents. She says it's great seeing all the pictures. Thank you, Cindy, for that nice comment. Okay, Dave. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just like to point out that through this, I've also met a lot of people on Facebook that are grew up in Beetown, and it's just amazing how many people like knew Rollo, and they all have similar stories to this, where that he was very prominent in the school. He was a janitor there, obviously, but also had all sorts of activities going on, and really cared about the members of the community.
So that kind of relates to the next question. Dave Ralph asks, what type of markers or plaques, if any, remain in Beetown to commemorate the museum's origins and Rollo's history?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any in town. I know that he actually put together a plaque for the origin of Beetown, and so or basically where the stump of the tree was at the but I don't know if that's even around yet. So, and also several years ago, the Beetown school, the roof caved in. So that's another, Beetown landmark that's gone by the wayside. But yeah, I don't know if there's been any plaques, but that's something that we might talk to Alvin Bontrager about putting something up.
Wonderful. Okay, Hap Dawes has an interesting question. Are the oral histories that Rollo recorded available? And if so, where?
Yeah, so Eric, if you want to touch on that, I think you might have more experience with the availability of them, but I know that the oral histories were actually on a wire recorder that in that winter of 1980-81, my dad and Miles Genthy dubbed onto reel-to-reel tapes, and then since subsequently dubbed it onto cassette tapes. And I think that I know that there's a set at the Southwest Wisconsin Room, and there's a set at I think that there's a set at the museum as well, if I'm correct on that. But I know at the Southwest Wisconsin Room, I just talking with James Hibbard, they don't have any way of playing those, so that presents a little bit of problem to you can see them, but you can't actually play them unless you bring in your own recording equipment and making sure that it's adequate to not damage the recordings.
Well, maybe this is a good time, Patrick, to just mention briefly some of the collections work that's underway at the museum now. So after the collection was brought from Beetown in 1980 or so, there was some work that occurred at the museum. There was some transcription, for example, of wire recordings. There was a large effort to take the index of field accession numbers that the museum staff, under then museum director Tom Hendrickson, had assigned to all of the artifacts, but then had to have new accession numbers assigned to them here at the museum. And the museum buildings were sort of made available as best they could to accommodate this huge collection, but with artifacts stored in basements and attics, as well as on unheated floors, and then as well as on display and conditioned parts of the buildings. And for the decades after that, a lot of the artifacts then remained relatively the same in terms of their location, where they were housed, and the way they were housed, etc. And so, and for the first time then since 1980, the museum is in the midst of a multi-year collection stewardship campaign. And so that was done in part in recent years under an Institute of Museum and Library Studies grant. And now we have a new grant, a federal grant funded program. It's an IMLS Inspire grant for small museums that are allowing us to work on rehousing objects, again, for in many cases for the first time since 1980, storing it in different buildings or in different places for the long-term preservation of objects. And that includes all objects, so big 3D objects like furniture or taxidermy or housewares or whatever it might be. But the priority have been the most fragile objects in the collection, things like textiles and paper. Objects were relocated from the Brick Hanmer Robbins building, pictured here, to the upper level of the Rock School building, which many people may remember as the former home of Roundtree Gallery. And that's a beautiful, clean, and fully conditioned, heated and cooled space that essentially now is becoming an archives at the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museum campus. So there has been some efforts in recent years to digitize some of those cassette recordings, Patrick, that you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. But the long-term goal of this collections management project is to make the collection more accessible to the public. Right now, the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museums is neither appropriately staffed nor ready yet to make such recordings or even photographs or other kinds of objects in the collection available to researchers. And we're working to remedy that by building a digital database in which every object and its description and photographs may be put in this database. We're a fraction of the way through, approximately 10% of that way through. And ultimately to make certain things available online for people to access from around the world, or at minimum at an archive facility on campus within approximately 5 years or so. So it's a long-term project that, it's a very exciting initiative, but it's a multi-year process.
Mm-hmm. So that's something that is like really interesting to see. 40 years later, we're still trying to figure out how we can best manage this and present it to people too, because it's just it is kind of overwhelming to some degree.
Well, I know, Patrick, you got to enjoy a behind the scenes tour recently, and I'd love to invite anyone out there who's not yet heard about the Collection Stewardship Project to give me a ring here at the museum, or shoot me an email, museumdirector@platteville.org. I'd be happy to schedule a behind the scenes tour with you if you'd like to see some of the rehousing work that's underway and how the new future archive space is shaping up. Because though it may seem overwhelming, just like back in 1980, you guys got it done. We're making a lot of tremendous headway right now, and I'd love to share off some of those accomplishments. So Dave asked a follow-up question: have the wire recordings been transferred to other media? And I think you touched on that, Patrick.
Yep.
I would like
yep.
that.
So they're on wire. Reel-to-reel tapes, and then cassette tapes, and some of them have been digitized as well. But I think there's still a lot of work to do, which Eric talked about.
Hap Dawes asked, did Rollo's father ever return to Wisconsin, or was the family, for all purposes, abandoned?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I wouldn't say that they were abandoned. There's definitely letters that Rollo's dad was telling the family to come to Canada because he found gainful employment. But for whatever reason, Stella didn't ever go there. So he passed away, I think it was 1926 or 29, I can't remember. But he never came back, as far as I know. But there were other Jamison family members that went up there, and at various different times too. So it's something that I don't know, it's still a mystery of, it wasn't really necessarily an entire abandonment, but it was definitely separated. So there's definitely interesting story there somewhere.
Angie Joyce says Rollo was her great uncle, but we never called him Rollo. We pronounced it Raleigh.
Yep, that's I should say that too. Is that basically everybody that I've talked to that has talked with him, other than like people that didn't really know him very, very long, like myself, they all called him Raleigh. I guess I was too young to do that. But
okay, Marianne Schultz says, huge thank you, Patrick. Great presentation and pictures. Okay, Angie Joyce says, from her recollection, the family background was English, possibly Welsh, because her mom was named Gwethelyn and her aunt was Gwendolyn.
Yeah.
Okay, Mike Daniels has a question. Is there an index or catalog of the wire recordings available? And do you want to speak to that, Patrick?
There is an index available. James Hibbard has that. And I'm pretty sure that that index is actually the one that my dad put together. back in 1981. And actually, Mike is interesting too, is that I think that he has at least some of the cassette tapes, or so he's my brother, and so he has cassette tapes of our family stuff, and he might have some some of the stuff that might have been dubbed onto the Jamison, or about the Jamison stuff. My dad, when the collection was still in Beetown, basically in that tradition of Rollo not writing things down, but still having a whole host of information on there, he basically spearheaded an effort to record Rollo as much as he could, and getting the history of each of these artifacts through Rollo's um, uh, interpretation of those artifacts. And so I know that those recordings, not necessarily the wire recordings, but the tape recordings, some of those were actually digitized too. So they have those at the museum too, and some of those were transcribed. But it was a quick transcription, and like a lot of names weren't necessarily in there as well too. Is that pretty accurate then, from your perspective, Eric?
Yeah, and a lot of these indexes or catalogs are typed, by typewriter on sheets of white paper, and so part of the long-term goal again is to have this digitized and made available to researchers, according to contemporary archival standards. And this vision, you can tell that maybe that may have been a vision that Jerry Daniels had in the 1980s. And so, our museum has had great success in recent years, both writing grants for projects such as digitizing our collections. We're slowly making our way through that, and also private fundraising for initiatives that people care about. And so, as the passion presents itself from its supporters, we're able to prioritize certain projects, particularly ones that are of popular demand. And so I think that we agree that the recordings that Rollo Jamison prepared are among the great national caliber items within the collection, and it makes a lot of sense to perhaps prioritize for the future making those recordings available. So if that's an initiative that you find particularly important, please feel free to share that information with me and the museum leadership. Okay, Larry Buntrigger has another question for you. Are those wire recordings available? Okay, hey, I think we hit on something here. Tracy Roberts asks, bouncing on that question, the Grant County Historical Museum, known as the Cunningham Museum, was in Platteville, not Lancaster, until about 1989. Do you remember that, Patrick?
Yeah, it was right next to, was it First? I was right next to the church by the city park. Yeah, and I remember going up to the second floor of that and having the diorama up there, and there's like a passenger pigeon in there. Yeah, I think that I don't think I've seen the Cunningham Museum when when it was moved to Grant County or to Lancaster, but yeah, I do remember seeing it in Platteville one or two times.
Just a little shout out to Tracy Roberts as well. She was a long-term member of the leadership here of the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museums, and a big part of some past initiatives with our collections care work. And she is now the executive director at the Grant County Historical Society. And I know that they are up to some interesting things, including having recently moved their collection from one building to a new building next door to help make it more accessible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they obviously they help provide a couple of the pictures that you saw in the presentation too. So that was very helpful to get that too.
Kathy Freiheit, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, seeing that Rollo never married but had a sister and two brothers, are there relatives with connections to the museum?
Yeah, I guess I don't know that many of them that were that are still connected with it. I know that there was quite a few relatives of some sort that were at the dedication. And one of the more prominent relatives was John Jamison, who ran the Beetown store for many years and just passed away last September. But as you can see in the comments, there are still relatives of his around.
Yes, associated with the passing of the gentleman you just described, Patrick, there was a distant family member who did come and visit me briefly at the museum. So I'm still working to get to know some of the living relatives, and it's nice to know that we still have a relationship. Now, Kent says, one of the first field trips I took students on was to see Rollo's museum. Oh, maybe that's Kent Sherrill, longtime educator. Kent also, oh, here we go. He says, Rollo let the students handle everything and they loved him. It was so wonderful to see the students having such a good time in a museum.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that Rollo liked to do is, basically, he thought that, you have a stuffy museum that just shows artifacts and you can't do anything with them. It really takes away from the whole experience of understanding what those artifacts are and that history is with them. And so I guess adding to that, that's one of the things that I do with the museum is demonstrate the music boxes and phonographs at the museum on Heritage Day. And I'm sure that every time that um, uh, anybody went to the museum in Beetown, the Regina music box would have been played, and the organette would have been played, and probably the Peter Pan gramophone would have been played, something. So really getting that context of not just looking at objects, but really being able to understand more about them.
Dave Meinhardt says he might be interested in volunteering to help digitize the recordings. Isn't that fabulous?
About time.
No, boy, just you imagine such a this grassroots effort in which just so many dozens of people helped drive in their own vehicles and just give so much of their time to moving the museum to Platteville from Beetown. It reminds me of the writing of the Oxford English Dictionary that required, it's just so much grassroots support. And, I should just send some shout out to our volunteers who continue to do a lot for the museum, many categories of work, depending on people's interests and skill sets. And I encourage you to visit our website, mining.jamison.museum, and there is a volunteer interest form for people who would like to contribute a couple of hours a year or a couple of hours a week to assisting with some initiatives. So Dave, okay, I'm going to be reaching out to you. We can talk more about that digitizing. Thank you. Okay, Todd Bowden. That was one of my favorite photos that you had there, Patrick, was there at the Hoist House bar with the young Todd Bowden and others. Todd says, I remember visiting Rollo in Beetown, traveling with my uncle Neil on the way to Cassville fishing. The museum was closed then, but Rollo was always welcoming visitors and showing parts of his collection. He was a wonderful man that really cared about the kids. I really enjoyed this presentation. Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, and you can see even in the postcards that are in the collection at the Southwest Wisconsin Room, there's many letters that are in there. Basically, the same thing. I know the museum was closed, but you let us in anyway, and it was so neat that you showed us the whole collection. And he's always, he's so gentle and caring, and really trying to share, you know what those history of the things that are in the collection, and really instilling with the children the respect for their parents as well, through through the museum. So, I know that at the entrance of the museum, he always had a bucket full of bazooka bubble gum. And so basically any of the kids that got in there, you could have a piece of bubble gum, because that was probably something to do that wouldn't be too distracting, and but still provide some sort of enjoyment for the children too. And I had my fair share of the bubble gum.
MB asks, Patrick, how did Rollo acquire the objects in his collection?
Yeah, so that's a interesting thing. He didn't really have a lot of money, but a lot of times the money that he did have, he'd go to great lengths to purchase something. But there's also a number of barter type of arrangements that he had, and some of them that the families or whatever would say that they'd loan it to him, or donate it to the museum at one point. And he also picked up stuff from the dump, the people that just were discarding for whatever reason, because it was, like old, like who wants to have an old phonograph when I've got the new hi-fi stereo system that now, and what do I do with this old piece of furniture? And that sort of thing. So he got it from a number of different places. I know that even when the collection was getting moved over to Platteville, there were people that as Rick Udelhoven said, people were coming out of the woodworking, saying, my grandparents donated this, and so I want it back. And it's like, well, they gave it to him, so that's part of the that heritage of the people recognize that with putting it in Rollo's collection, it would have further use than some sort of private sale, something like that.
Dave says, does the museum have collections in addition to the Rollo Jamison collection? Do you want to take a stab at that, Patrick?
Do I want to take a stab at that? Well, I know that there are continuing things that are artifacts that are being brought into the collection, but the museum is actually the mining museum, the mining and Rollo Jamison Museum. So it's actually, part of the whole complex is the mining museum as well. But over the years, basically, if there's object of interest that you want to donate to the museum, that is relevant to the mission of the museum, they've been accepting them. I know that to that end, there's a couple of items that are at the museum that are from our family. I think the first one was actually a Smith Corona typewriter from 1956, and then there's also a Philco radio that my dad donated as well. And there's as part of the efforts that they're doing, they're trying to understand more about the collections from the backside of it, as Eric had talked about, the process that he toured me through, and in one of the tours, I saw a metal dollhouse that I remember playing with as a kid, because that was my mom's and she donated that as well as the dollhouse artifacts too, or the furniture for it. So there's still opportunities to do that. Oh, and another really interesting one is a roller organ the Hill family donated. That was, and that's from the early 1900s, and it's definitely the same style as the concert roller organ that's at the museum too. So so that really aids in like kind of that complete Southwest Wisconsin history in whatever artifacts that are from the community as well. Is that adequate, or you you want to touch more on it?
I think you actually did a really nice job on that, Patrick. Yeah, because the museum was formed in stages. First as the mining museum, we do have one of the larger collections in the upper Midwest of mining related artifacts in general, but specifically we um, are, and in the future will be even more clear on a world scale, not just being a regional museum, but the only museum in the world dedicated to upper Mississippi Valley ore deposits. There's actually an ore deposit type. These limestone hosted lead and zinc deposits are named for this region, and we're the only museum in the world dedicated to MVTs. And so that collection of everything from rocks and minerals to heavy equipment, dump trucks and dozers and trains, train tracks, to safety equipment like hard hats, lamps, lanterns, all kinds of industrial equipment. That does make an important part of our collection. And you read some of the categories of the things in Rollo's collection. It's wonderful. From agriculture, armaments, blacksmithing and metalwork, clothing, dishes and glassware, furniture, home utensils, containers and knickknacks, jewelry, leather, harnesses, saddles, shoes, tools and equipment, library and archival and paper ephemera, lighting, equipment and supplies, medical, retail, dental, minerals, fossils, Indian artifacts, musical instruments, recreation, toys, games, sports, dollhouses, bicycles, stoves, heating, cooking, sound equipment, transportation, taxidermy, and woodworking. Wow. And as Patrick said, there was a general museum collection, and over the decades, the museum has accepted donations from the community. And for the last approximately 5 years, we actually do have a moratorium on new acquisitions, except in very specific cases when the museum board will vote to allow us to accept certain gifts that are of such singular connection to our mission to preserve the history of southwestern Wisconsin. Often it's things with a mining emphasis that would be the gifts most likely to be received at this time until we complete, again, this first inventory completed since 1980 and building the digital catalog. And then we can reassess at that time. Great. Okay, I think we really answered that question to death, Patrick. Nancy Daniels says Rollo visited his father sometime in the 1920s.
1931 was when Rollo visited his father, but I don't think he actually met up with him because he met up with family, but I don't know, maybe he went more than once. But the only photos are of him going to Canada in 1931, which would have been past when his father was still alive.
Thank you. Tom Young says, thank you, Patrick. Excellent job and very well organized. Harriet Dieter asks, does the museum accept donations of local history? Okay, so it's sort of a follow-up question. Though we have a moratorium on new acquisitions, what I would say is that we do have a process by which you should feel free to call or email me. My email address, again, museumdirector@platteville.org. And what I typically ask for would be a photograph or multiple photographs of the objects together with a description of as much of the history of the object as you know, its provenance and how you came to own it and how it might be connected to this region and to the mission of the museum. And then I can bring that to the museum board that ultimately would make the decision on whether or not to accept that generous donation. We say, even though that may seem difficult, because so often generous people, when they're doing things like cleaning out the basement, their first impulse is to drive by and drop it off. But we have to be real careful about not having people drop off things in a moment of purging, but rather do please reach out to me, and we very much appreciate your considering making donations to the museum. Okay, Angie Joyce says, John Jamison was a great guy.
Yeah, and I guess the other one that she also puts on this is it that he says that her grandmother was Stella, his sister. So it really shows that there are still people around that are related to him, and yeah, and from what I know of John, I don't remember meeting him, but yeah, he was definitely a great guy and a great softball coach, and uh, is really somebody that was really kind of a pillar of Beetown.
Cindy Bush says, very interesting presentation, Patrick, and well done. What a great childhood you had. She says, thank you for all the good work you're doing at the museum, too.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it was a great experience for me to really understand somebody like that. And I mean, I only knew Rollo for maybe a little over a year, and he definitely had a lifelong impact on me. Really, you know, in querying, what's the history of where things came from, and how they work, and all that too. So yeah, that was definitely a good experience.
Do you mind if I interject in kind of a follow-up question? Do you feel that, having been part of doing interpretation at the museum in collections work and all the kinds of work you did for the museum starting at such a young age, how do you think that helped your, development, or what kind of person you may have become over the years?
Well, I guess I would say that it sort of set me apart in like always not necessarily looking at what is going on right now, and being like totally in tune with the top 40 uh you know um whatever's the music or whatever that's going on, but really having a broader understanding of those contexts, and where some of that stuff came from, and looking at how some of those processes are kind of put together, and I think that it really leads into what I do is a living. I'm work for Applied Ecological Services as a uh, uh, field technology specialist. So I'm looking at like what happened on landscape, and how we can understand how we can somehow measure what's going on that landscape, and I think that some of the things that the ingenuity that he had in some of these things, it really has helped me with putting together some of these you know uh, uh, equipment arrays, and dealing with problems in the field, and all that sort of thing. But as far as the interpretation, the Heritage Day, that's been something that's been evolving since the day one, and I know that for my dad passed away in 2009, and I don't know, probably for the last 10 years of his life, maybe not quite that long, but a good section of it. He was saying, well, you've taken to more understanding of this than I have, so you should just be doing it instead of me. So basically, he'd spell me at lunch, so I'd at least get down and get a brat from the music boosters, and get listen to the windows for at least a song or two, and before heading back up to interpret more on the machines, and that sort of thing. So I guess from that perspective, I've like kind of developed into at least a fairly knowledgeable person in those instruments at the museum.
Fabulous. Stephanie Sager Barrett says, we have your mom's wedding dress as well, Patrick, here in the collection.
Yeah, as well as some other artifacts from wedding. So yeah, but yeah, Stephanie was, I really appreciate her chiming in here. She's uh, fixture at the museum for so long. It's like I don't even remember necessarily her not being there. So it's nice to see her on here.
Absolutely. Stephanie was a longtime museum curator. And you may remember that if for those who saw Tamara Funk in her Winter Lyceum presentation 2 years ago, actually it was in March 2019, she presented courtship and wedding rituals of the late 18th century through the 20th century. And interpreted a number of different textile objects, including your mother's wedding dress. And it's a certainly very beautiful artifact as well.
Mhm.
Thank you, Stephanie, for mentioning that. Okay, Kent Sherrill says Louis Eversol's amateur radio collection that the museum has is a very good history of that hobby. The local amateur radio club has shown it privately twice, and that was very much appreciated. Thank you, Ken. Yeah, that's a great example of another subset of our collection that may be underappreciated, but you see this wonderful span of like the cultural history, the way of life, but we do have a lot of these great artifacts that relate to sort of the know-how. It can do, the can-do spirit and interesting know-how of the tinkerer of our region. And
Yeah, and Rollo is a good example of that. Basically, taking or making a patented um, uh, antenna, or hat with a CB antenna, and that was very much in that amateur radio genre, I guess, or whatever you want to call it. And as part of uh, kind of a civil service for flooding events that happened in the Beetown area in the 60s. So yeah, there's definitely a connection there with Rollo was definitely, you can see that in the pictures of his facility. He had pretty good CB radios and antennas along with his trailer too. So yeah.
Greg Sedbrook mentions the mine near Rollo's museum. Rollo had material on the Atkinson mine just west of Beetown too, a huge mine at the time.
Yep. Yeah, so that's a Muskellunge Atkinson mine. Uh, uh, and it basically ran from Beetown to North Andover, so it's like 10 miles long, and he would take school kids in there. Lyle Taylor was typically the person that helped out with those tours. So he's also, I think he lived in Cassville, at least. Yeah, I went. I think I went with him, or we met at his house to go to the mine and get information on it. I can't remember exactly what happened, but I have been in that mine too. And I just would point out, I would be derelict if I didn't, that mine spelunking is definitely an issue now that the bats have white nose syndrome, which is a very infectious fungus, which has really decimated the bat population in North America since 2008. So some like one of the species, the little brown bat, is probably less than 90%, or less than 10% of it. About 90% mortality has happened since 2008 on that particular species, basically because of this disease, or the fungus. So wherever we can, I think most of these abandoned mines have had, they've been covered up and that sort of thing, so that they have mine grate entrances to allow bats to come and go, but people not. And if you do go in if you are allowed into it, you have to go through a pretty rigorous um, cleanup process, and making sure that the equipment that you're bringing in isn't contaminated, along with the clothing too. So just point that out too. So it's a little bit different than Rollo's time, where he had school kids going into mines. I don't think OSHA would really approve of that either.
Right. No, you hear about some of the collecting that took place even as recently as the 1970s, and there's some techniques that sounded, straight out of Indiana Jones. Some of those practices, might not be considered best practice today. But this topic that you just raised, boy, I'd be interested in a whole Lyceum presentation on that subject, maybe in a future year, Patrick.
Yeah, I am basically the bat biologist at work as well. I do acoustic monitoring of bats as well. So
Okay.
looking for mainly for wind farm sightings, because they tend to get tied up with wind turbines, and that's not good.
Well, okay, I'm going to remember that for the future, Patrick. In recent years, we had a biologist bring some bats, and people got to pet the bats and hold the bats and learn a bit about them, and that was very popular. Also, I don't know if you recall, but last year, before the pandemic hit, we were just kicking off a new series for small children at the museum called Animal House at the museum, in partnership with the Small Mammal and Reptile Lab at the UW Platteville campus, managed by Dr. Peterson. And so we did hold one animal house with some snakes and insects, and it was fascinating for some hands-on before we had to move to all virtual. And so we look forward to kind of bringing more life sciences to the museum campus to add to, the rich lineup of culture and science that we already present. People love bats.
I'll tell you, I don't handle any of the bats. I just listen to them. So.
Oh, well, maybe you could bring one of your bat handler friends along. Okay, let's see. Kathy, Nancy Daniels says Harriet Dieter was married to Merlin Gerke. I didn't remember that or know that.
Yeah, and she's actually very interesting to talk to about those early days. So yeah, I did get her information, and actually her sons also Brad and Brian helped with the move. There's Steve Cleefish said, well, it's the Gerke boys, they're doing it, but I mean there's several high school boys that were bringing in the brawn to help move some of the heavier objects, and like pianos. Yeah, Steve has one story where he was like trying to clean an area out in the east display in the gym at the time, and to make way for a piano that they had in one of the trucks, and he said that the Gerke boys just decided to manhandle it and took it right up the stairs. So yeah, there's definitely some determination on getting that collection, from Beetown and put into the Hamner Robbins School as efficiently and quickly as practical, and kind of ended up with some interesting pieces in maybe not quite ideal places. And I think there's still some in the tour that I had, I still think that there's some of that that probably hasn't been touched since 1981 or 1980 actually. So it was set up there, and it's going to take some pretty strong guys to get it moved again.
I'm remembered of the 80-20 rule, with 20% of the work takes 80% of the time. I feel like the pioneering that was done in 1980 was fantastic. It had to be done to put it everywhere that it could be. And now, 80% of the time is spent just refining.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Kathy Freiheit adds, kudos to the Mining and Rollo Jamison Museums for a delightful presentation. That credit goes to you there, Patrick. She says she had the privilege of working with both Jerry and Nancy Daniels in her tenure as the director of the Platteville Public Library. And says thank you for keeping our history alive.
Yeah, Dad was definitely, he wasn't initially really involved with the public library because he was the director of the Carmen Library at the university, and but both of them are very big supporters of library sciences and libraries in general. So, and actually, my dad is. They have a library association hall of fame, and he's on that as well. So.
Nancy Daniels says Patrick tried to follow in Rollo's footsteps by collecting all sorts of things.
Yep. Yeah. I guess one of the things that I you can see the collection here. It is mostly family stuff, but I did kind of start to collect bottles as well. Dr. Gerlach was he was one of the librarians, and he's like, oh, if you want bottles, I've got bottles. And so so I kind of definitely took that collecting bug on, but and I do have have collected 78 RPM records, and looking at that older genre of like kind of what was popular back then, and really it stems out of that working with that collection at the Jamison Museum, with the phonographs there, and then I've got a phonograph here too. So I've really kind of following in that footsteps, but not necessarily as much into the historical side of those, and really looking at that local history. And I think that's one of the areas that Rollo really excelled at, is tying those different objects to the local history, and understanding how they fit into that context.
Great point. This is a great year to sort of look back at Rollo and his strengths, and to help revitalize our interpretation of Rollo. So thank you for that. Corey Kopp says, your dad must be beaming, Patrick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I
would hope so.
Do you remember the Kopp girls and other Kopp family members from your years here at the museum?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I know that. I actually probably knew Corey the least, partly because I think she was more shy than her sister Keely. Keely was fairly gregarious, and my brother was friends with Kenyon. But yeah, I mean, her parents were just awesome people. I mean, you can't find a kinder person than Gail, and I always appreciated Wes's sense of humor too. So, and I mean, he did some amazing woodworking stuff too. So, I think that he's a really good asset for the museum to have too for so many years.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it goes without saying, but her parents are Gail and Wesley Kopp, such an important part of the museums. Wes, we all mourned the loss of Wes last year when he passed away. He worked for 37 consecutive Heritage Days with the the treadle jigsaw, cutting out wooden animals to give to children and to remember the Kopp family. You may know the museum inaugurated the Gail and Wes Kopp Memorial Pollinator Garden in the Garden Terrace along Main Street and Virgin Avenues last year. So thank you, Corey, so much for your comment.
So the first couple years, he actually had a pedal-powered table saw that he demonstrated as well. You know, there's only so much you can do. So, you know, the pedal powered jigsaws, you know, kind of took over that.
Angie Joyce says Lyle Taylor lived in Bloomington.
Right. Yeah.
At least while raising his family.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, any other last questions here? Nancy Daniels says, thank you for a great program. Thank to you, Nancy, and to all who participated with 40 questions and comments. I think that demonstrates people were very engaged with your presentation. Thank you, Patrick, very much.
Yeah, and also thanks to Mom. I mean, she kept records of her time in as a publicity chairperson, and so that was actually a pretty big foundation for this talk. You know, and you know, obviously without the internet, we wouldn't be able to get some of this context. But I was kind of pleasantly surprised how I was able to piece everything together. So thoroughly and with all the people that are you know, engaged in it, and still, you know, 40 years later, so many people are you know, really remember a lot of what happened.
Wonderful. Well, we thank you ever so much for kicking off this year's Winter Lyceum. And I'd like to invite everyone to sign up, if they haven't already, for the next Lyceum talk, which will be Black History, the Legacy of Slavery and Freedom in Wisconsin, with Dr. Gene Tesdall and Claiborne Benson. That'll be Sunday, February 21st. We're taking next Sunday off for Valentine's Day, so we'll look forward to seeing you all on February 21st. Again, thank you, Patrick, so much. Thanks to all for your participation, and good night.
Yep, thanks.
At Taco John's, we're blowing up your phone with great deals. The only problem is how many there are.
Crunching, 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 crunching.
Sorry, not sorry. Taco John's. Bigger, bolder, better.